everyone and welcome. I am Yağmur Civan Uyanık and I am the Administrative Assistant at Koç University's Research Center for Anatolian Civilizations. Thank you for joining us for our monthly webinar meeting. For this month's talk titled Sultanahmet, Istanbul's Historic Peninsula, Musealization and Urban Conservation, we are hosting former ANAMED Fellows Pınar Aykaç and Belgin Turan Özkaya. The talk will be moderated by Belgin Turan Özkaya, who is a professor of architectural history in the Department of Architecture at Middle East Technical University. She is interested in connected histories of the long 19th century and the cultures and spaces of collecting and mobility. Among her publications are Rethinking Architectural Historiography and the Collections, Transposition on the Edge of Europe, Ambivalence and Difference in Architecture, Ambivalent Architectures from the Ottoman Empire to the Turkish Republic, and Travel. She was co-director of the British Academy project, Ambivalent Geographies, which led to her current work on monograph, Itinerant Objects, British Museum and the Ottoman Response to Antiquity, and the co-edited volume, Ottoman Cultural Mobilities, 19th Century Modes of Travel, Collecting and Display. A Q&A session will follow the talk. You are more than welcome to write your questions into the Q&A button throughout the event. I also would like to inform you that the microphones and all videos of all attendees are turned off automatically and that this event is being recorded. Now I am leaving the microphone to our moderator Belgin Hanım to introduce our speaker and start the conversation. Have a great talk.
Thank you very much, Yağmur, for this very generous introduction. So I think now it's my turn to introduce the speaker, the real speaker of this talk today. But before that, I should also emphasize that I'm very happy to be here today to discuss the very interesting and important book of Pınar Aykaç with her. So let me give a brief information about Pınar. Pınar is an assistant professor at Middle East Technical University's Department of Architecture in Ankara, Turkey. A colleague of mine, we teach at the same department. She received a Master of Science in Conservation of Cultural Heritage from the same university, from Middle East Technical University, and a PhD from UCL, the Bartlett School of Architecture. She was a Weinberg Fellow at Columbia University's Italian Academy for Advanced Studies in America during the fall semester of 2017 and 2018. And she's the author of a big achievement for a young up-and-coming scholar. She is the author of Sultanahmet, Istanbul's Historic Peninsula, Musealization and Urban Conservation, which was published by Lexington Books 2022, and the co-editor of Architectures of Emergency in Turkey, Heritage, Displacement and Catastrophe, IB Tars, published by IB Tars 2021, together with Eray Çaylı and Sevcan Ercan. So we will be talking about the book today, both in terms of the form of it, her approach, the whole process of writing the book, but also, of course, the very important contents of it as well. Perhaps I can start with my take on the book very briefly in a couple of sentences. Then I would like to turn to Pınar and ask if that is an accurate portrayal of what she wrote. To me, this book traces the perennial transformation of the Sultanahmet district in Istanbul since the second half of the 19th century. It does this through the lens of heritage formation, and importantly, it foregrounds a persistent urban process that it defines as musealization. by using the metaphor of musealization, it critiques the book, critiques the sterilization and transformation of the sites and spaces of the Sultanahmet district into touristic heritage sites. Basically, it highlights 5 distinct phases of this process, of this musealization, when cultural and historical foci were shifted. I think we will be coming to this in detail, this privileging of different cultural layers at different periods. So, Pınar, do you think that it's an accurate portrait? How would you define your project yourself?
Thank you very much again for your generous introduction of me, Belgin Hocam, and thank you also for ANAMED. And also maybe I would like to thank from the beginning. I was planning to thank later, but I was an ANAMED fellow during my PhD, and it really contributed a lot to my PhD study and my book, which is also a continuation or based on my PhD study. So first, like I didn't have any like official presentation, but we thought maybe I can share at least the book's title to all of you, like the book's cover. So as Belgin Hoca said, the book is Sultanahmet, Istanbul's Historic Peninsula, Musealization and Urban Conservation. So more or less, as Belgin Hoca also briefly summarized, like what I was trying to do in this book based on my PhD was actually first questioning the concept of museums. So like when we were going to any like historic city, everyone was talking about like, okay, this place is looking like a museum, it resembles a museum. So sometimes in a positive way, but sometimes of course in a pejorative way. So what I had in mind is like what museum as a concept or a notion transforms like not only objects, but expands from the boundaries of objects to buildings themselves, and then to historic cities through this process of what I call musealization, which is a bit difficult to pronunciate maybe, but it's more like how that process makes historic cities like museum-like, what I might call places. So it traces this history of musealization in Sultanahmet from the 19th century onwards, because like Sultanahmet, as we all know, was from the kind of establishment of Constantinople, what we might call the public space or public face of Istanbul. It was the like center, and then later become the symbolic center, and currently like we might call the public face of Istanbul. So more or less like my book is based on or discusses this process through the transformation of Sultanahmet's urban form, and what we might call it as the history of heritage making of Istanbul through this process, more or less.
You actually answered my second question, your motivations behind this project, and which seems that, I mean, this critique of museums and musealization seems to be like really one of the major things that you were after. Well, building on that, I mean, does that mean that you see I mean, it's obvious that you see a parallel between the museum proper that we know, like the museums, as you know, interior spaces where objects are displayed, and what is going on in relation to urban heritage. So you do see a similar process going on. I mean, do you want to dwell on that a little bit? I mean, because I'm working on the, the formation of the museum. I have a degree in well, back then it was called historic preservation. Now it's called conservation of cultural heritage. I tend to differentiate those things. And after reading your book, I was really enlightened about the parallels that can be actually established. So do you want to talk about this? I mean, you said that you started as aiming a critique of the museum, and you see that parallel with the heritage formation. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, actually, the concept itself, I also really started to actually question when I was working in a museum project, I might call it, or a restoration project of Atatürk's museum pavilion in Ankara, the presidential pavilion as we know. So there, the aim was, of course, restoring the building, because it's the second, we might call, the residential place of President Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. But it was originally a vineyard house, which was owned by an Armenian merchant. But then later, of course, after Atatürk moved to the building, there were a couple of renovations by very important architects like Vedat Tek and Seyfi Arkan. But in the end, during the restoration works, a lot of different periods of the building were unearthed, including 19th century ornamentations. But what happened in the end, because it was important for we might call the national history of Turkey, the museological approach was presenting the building as if Atatürk left the building to Pembe Kiosk, Pembe Köşk in 1930s. So there was a choice there. So when you go and visit the building now, there's not any indicator that the building was a 19th century vineyard house, but the Armenian merchant's story is not presented in the building. So there I was more exposed to the practical maybe results of converting a building into a museum. Then I start questioning the concept, what we might call. So also I discuss a bit in the book, but what a museum does as a process to objects is first it's decontextualize the objects from their contexts by valuing them as something, a representation of something else, and then it recontextualizes it through a certain narrative in a museum context. So this is more or less related to museum objects, but for the buildings themselves or the historic city itself, more or less it's this time curates the city itself by decontextualizing certain aspects and signifying certain ones and presenting themselves within a coherent narrative. So more or less it's of course the scale changes, but in a way the process more or less does the same thing with the objects.
Exactly. Then the curating seems to be the key word here. I mean, that is operative in both cases. There is a curation going on within the context of the city as well, in the historic sites. I mean, and selection, of course, and perhaps privileging of certain historical, layers or cultural layers over others that you also observe in Sultanahmet, I think, no? Yeah, exactly. That is very helpful for my understanding. I mean, well, in terms of museums, musealization, and heritage formation, I think you talked about what triggered your interest. I mean, your earlier work in a museum. But what about Sultanahmet? I mean, why Sultanahmet?
Now, sometimes after finishing the PhD and the book, I sometimes regret why I picked Sultanahmet. But like, of course, like I was planning to work on a case thoroughly. So like I'm Turkish and I know the Turkish maybe heritage making process and I'm more familiar with that. So like this process is more or less obvious in certain parts of Turkey and Istanbul, but particularly in Sultanahmet, because it was actually the city center in the late Roman and Byzantine period, in the Ottoman period also to a certain extent, and then it became the symbolic center of the Ottoman Empire, so that actually what I call when this idea of musealization and urban context started more or less in Ottoman Empire's own past, from the significant monuments like Topkapı Palace or Ayasofya, and also in later periods, early republics approach or attitude towards the Ottoman past and its heritage was also very prominent in Sultanahmet. And in later periods, now it's one of the most touristic places in Istanbul. So like everyone tries to visit there, and every like aspects of the district is more or less like directed towards the outsiders and tourists. So more or less it was like a really good case to discuss with different aspects, unlike other parts of Turkey. But as I told, I regret because it's a bit difficult.
That was my
course,
question.
yes.
What are the regrets?
I have many regrets, starting with, like, of course, I'm joking, but first things first, like when I started actually my PhD also, I was planning to read every single published material on Istanbul, so that I can have a background information and like build on it. But in the end, I realized that it was a lost cause, that wasn't possible. So I'm more focused on like the sources discussing like urban history, heritage making, or urban planning and conservation of Sultanahmet. And of course, the other regret is like it has a lot of data, like Sultanahmet, from like when you don't have a time frame that is like more like a limited time frame. But I start from the 19th century until the time when the urban conservation plan was approved. So it's more or less like 2014-15. So it's a huge time period. There are lots of like huge amount of data. So to process all that data was also more or less like took and like my 1 year just to process the data and start like evaluating on that. With Sultanahmet's complex nature, that was my biggest challenge, I might say.
Yeah, it certainly makes sense. And that actually brings us to our next question about your archives.
Yeah.
What kind of archives did you have to engage with? I mean, any kind of like, you have very nice visual material as well. So what kind of archives did you work in?
So throughout, like, of course, like my aim was trying to understand the history of heritage making more or less through the lens of musealization in Sultanahmet. My first and foremost, most important archive was the Istanbul 4th Regional Conservation Council's archive. So that's the major decision-making body in Turkey when you do conservation works, like both projects and implementations. So I was like both lucky and unlucky to a certain extent So it took really maybe 2 months even to find someone to talk about first in order to get permission to enter the archives. But in the end, like afterwards, like I might maybe talk it later, but I managed to enter the archive. They have different types of archives from 1920s until 1953, like because the conservation councils change in time by conservation regulations. Other than that, Istanbul Metropolitan Municipalities Archive, I used Istanbul Historic Sites Management Directorate's archive, BİMTAŞ for visual, more or less like all the historic maps I obtained from BİMTAŞ, including like cadastral maps. Of course, like presidential state archives, both the Ottoman and Republican. I tried to enter the archives of German Archaeological Institute, IFEA. Those are the ones that I can remember for now.
Perhaps we can also get some hints from you about especially the archives of the Preservation Council. I mean, from your book, I get the sense that they are all very nicely classified because you have a lot of material. And I mean, I was really proud that I was also surprised that the Regional Preservation Council committee had such material. But how is the situation in reality in terms of those archives and the municipality archive?
So, like, since it's still a functioning institution, I think first things first, their archives was not systematic at all. Unfortunately, there was like a person like 10 years ago who tried to classify certain aspects, like based on some themes, like Sultanahmet Archaeological Park, for example, was one theme, or like the celebration of 15th anniversary of Istanbul's conquest. So those kinds of themes, but within those, what we might call like folders, the condition of even the papers were not really great. Some of them had dampness problems. They were like highly deteriorated. So in a way, they weren't also, when I was studying, they weren't digitized. So it took like almost like 3 or 4 months for me to check every single file and try to find the things that is useful for me, because sometimes, since they're not classified, I found things from other folders. So that was a challenge for me. And also I might say, like, Ümit Fırat Açıkgöz, who is also a friend of mine, he was also really trying to find a lot of archival documents. So we were together. And also my ANAMED fellow, Aslı Zeren, was also doing something on Istanbul for her PhD. So we were every day more or less going to the council, trying to find some documents and sharing them among each other. So it was really challenging. And for the later periods, so after 1978, when the Preservation Commission was abolished by law, the regional council's own archive is a like functioning archive. So still, for example, if we are making a project on, I don't know, Ayasofya, for example, you have the file of Ayasofya. So the people working there are checking on that to say certain things or write certain reports about that. So that was even more difficult, because like you have to go there. Maybe that file was in process because the council will give a decision on that particular case, or there might be like a conflicting situation about a certain aspect, which was always the case actually. so that wasn't easy to access those files. So it was really like I can write really a book just on the archival research parts of the book itself.
So it was one of the challenges. Were there others?
Yes.
What were the other challenges?
The other challenges, like, of course, like I have other challenges in other archives, I might say. So in the end, I'm happy that I managed to enter the Regional Conservation Council, but accessibility to archives is a real challenge, I think, and it's getting even worse and worse in Turkey. So I was a bit luckier at the time, but now I think things are a bit more complicated. For example, like everyone, if you're a historian, it's really easy to enter Istanbul archaeology museums, for example. I don't think anyone had issues with it. But in my case, I like officially applied 3 times, but in the end, I was denied access on the grounds that Sultanahmet Archaeological Park has an ongoing lawsuit, so that they cannot give like more recent data about like the things that I was asking for. So like in the end, like I was thinking archival research, we also discussed with other friends, and I even published it also in an article. That became like research in itself, accessibility to archives. It tells a lot about heritage making in Istanbul and in Turkey currently. So the archival attitudes of different institutions really tells a lot about the current situation of heritage making in Turkey. So my biggest challenge was still archival research. Also during field trip, I have some challenges to enter certain parts of Sultanahmet due to like some restrictions, like certain parts of it was closed or certain parts were within the authority of the museum. The other parts were private ownership. So maybe access to archives and access to actual places was the most challenging part, I think, of the book and the PhD.
Yeah, it certainly makes sense. Access is the biggest problem in terms of research in Turkey. I mean, that is my experience as well. I'm still waiting to be able to enter the archives of the archaeology museum, so I can relate to that. Yeah, access is a big issue, really. Okay, well, passing to another our wounds about the archive, from that to these different disciplines that you and I seem to be really kind of are touching upon. I mean, I was thinking, how do you define this? This is your book is a history of urban conservation, hands off. Once we used to call it historic preservation. Now the program that we have at Middle East Technical University is called Conservation of Cultural Heritage. So there is this entanglement of different conventionally different disciplinary fields like history, conservation of cultural heritage, and also perhaps, as this gives us a little bit chance to discuss critical heritage studies. I know that yours is not exactly the prototype of that, but perhaps we can also bring that in, as it is actually a critical study. I mean, your book is actually a very critical of certain practices, we may say. So, what do you think about these different disciplines? How do you define your project?
I think, like, in the end, what I tried to do was more or less like you really put it well, and history of heritage making in Sultanahmet, more or less. I tried to dwell on the history of heritage making. But I think like this musealization as a term is really comprising different disciplines and attitudes. So more or less like, okay, like it doesn't deal with maybe texts or textual materials, but it's more or less like trying to make a new urban historical narrative through certain transformations. So more or less like the urban context is now like an agent of historiography or history writing, what we might call. So still, but like in my DNA, I'm of course a heritage person. So more or less what I try to like do is like historiography of heritage studies also in a way, because like as you said, like historic preservation was a conceptualization that started in the 19th century. We can still call it if you are in the US, but now we call it even conservation and heritage, which is more or less like post 1980s terminology. So depending on the conceptualization of what to conserve. So more or less, like I also thought about these like differentiation of different concepts in different times. But when it comes to like its relationship with like critical heritage studies, I might say still maybe to certain extent I'm a bit doing critical heritage studies, because like before 1980s, historic conservation was seen as something more like an objective. Also, it's like in history also that's the same as a discipline. It was seen as like an objective or like scientific field with like more universal or predetermined principles and isolated from like cultural or ideological policies. So more or less like I dwell on how the conceptualization of heritage is itself political and depending on like different political agenda in different periods. So it's more or less like an amalgamation of like the disciplines maybe at the center more or less, but still closer to heritage studies more or less.
Very nice. Yeah, perhaps we can go a little bit more in detail in the contents of the book. I was thinking about this concept that you have very nicely explained to us, musealization. In the book, that process that you highlight cuts across different periods. Both the Ottoman and the Republican. I mean, you bring it up to our time, so it is valid for the peace, occupation, and war. Different types of contexts are at issue, and I was thinking, perhaps I wonder if it is possible to talk about different modalities of musealization. For me, as a non-expert on these issues, I was thinking about, basically three periods that you single out seem to be very intriguing to me. One of them is of course, the Ottoman period, because I'm very much interested in the 19th century, where this heritage formation was very much about the singular edifices. It was just starting. So that is, and perhaps I am also kind of prejudiced with my, a little bit outmoded knowledge, belief in the good intentions of heritage making in terms of this universal value of heritages, that kind of thing. And we architectural historians are really kind of excited about the Ottoman, for instance, emergence of consciousness on the part of the Ottomans about, for instance, the Byzantine, past. Göksun Akyürek writes about it like really very nicely, that there is a certain kind of perhaps consciousness about the Byzantine heritage was kind of emerging in the 19th century on the part of the Ottomans. For architectural historians, that is something kind of positive, interesting, nice. But you are also putting that period in, as part of musealization that you actually deeply criticize. This is the first, period for me, which is very intriguing. And then you are talking about the early Republican period as kind of a privileging of the, the Byzantine heritage again, for political reasons, but there is that. Then I think those two periods, in terms of what you are saying, are very interesting for me. But then I think that the third period that seems to be very interesting is after the 1980s. I mean, when tourism is much more like kind of a mass tourism, very much supported by the state. It is like, and the tackling of heritage as some kind of an, a commodification of heritage. I kind of see like kind of different modalities in terms of musealization in these three distinct, periods that you presented us. What do you think about that? I mean, do you see differences, particularly about this? After the 1980s, this whole mass tourism and the state's support and the neoliberal policies that seem to be, to me, like qualitatively different than the emergence of a consciousness about heritage as something valuable in itself, perhaps universally valuable. I don't know if I
Yes.
myself clear. What do you think about that?
Actually, I also like thought of this a lot. So am I really forcing too much? Like, am I trying to impose like a concept on a case, when I was like really discussing like different periods, but in a way, actually, musealization or like as a concept, as we might call, also cultural heritage is more or less the same. Like the conception of what is to be preserved is in itself selected. So actually it starts from that stage. So musealization just adds another layer. Okay, like first you pick something and deem to be like more valuable than the rest. In the 19th century it was, and also in the 20th and like until 1950s, the more or less like historic monuments, like monumental buildings for that. So then like by definition the rest becomes not valuable. So like how you deal with that like more valuable object in an urban context is more or less like accentuating it, like clearing away its immediate vicinity, which are more or less like residential urban fabric at the time, and like presenting it as if it is a museum object. So in a way, like it's more or less related to our conceptualization of what is valuable or not. And like, of course, in the Republican period, maybe our conceptualization of cultural heritage was still similar. So still historic monuments were considered heritage, not urban areas. But of course, there was an important like ideological shift. So more or less like, okay, in the late Ottoman period, we can trace also in the early Republican period, the idea of this time like national monuments, what's national or not. But then in the early Republican period, the Republican authorities distanced themselves not only from the Ottoman past, but to be, like similarly not only from the Byzantine, but also the Ottoman past. So they have like a different way of relating to the past and its heritage itself. And also like after 1980s, okay, it starts maybe with neoliberal policies and commodification of heritage, but it's more or less always starts with, again, what we conceptualize as heritage. So this time it's the historic urban areas becoming heritage objects. So how you can deal with them, because they are considered different than the rest of the urban fabric. So then like expropriations begin. So like they can't continue their lives as residential neighborhoods because they were different than the rest. So they become like touristic functions and hotels, cultural facilities. So more or less, the key is like how we conceptualize heritage. So based on that, musealization has also different modalities, more or less, throughout its like development.
I think this completely makes sense. You emphasize this selection process, which means the eradication or overlooking of certain layers. I was wondering, do you come across any example where different layers were tried to be presented, conserved, preserved all together? I'm thinking about, we have worked on the organizational conference,
Yes.
on this issue of the continuities between different cultural and historical layers in any kind of site architecture, heritage, what you have. So are there any examples of that, or you think that conservation is always about eradication as well?
In fact, like there are like really earlier discussions on, for example, Topkapı Palace. Nilay Özlü is like really portraying it really well, but in terms of heritage perspective, so during the early interventions, the 19th century additions to the monument was demolished. So more or less like the certain parts of the kitchen, the stable areas. So there, like the discussion was like, it's an important national monument. So all its historical evolution until today should be presented in a continuity. So that was an early discussion for the Ottoman period. And also, of course, Ayasofya is an important example when like different cultural layer can coexist together to a certain extent. Maybe we can discuss its current situation now. Or in the end, like the difference between like musealization and conservation is like officially, if you have different layers, you can't demolish them. So more or less, like officially, you can't do it. But with musealization, you can diminish one layer over the other and present the other layer. So that's the major difference. So like after 1980s, when we check certain demolishments or eradication, more or less they are either they were either like unauthorized or illegal, or there were like still lawsuits about them, but more or less in terms of like how to preserve or not, when you see the layer there and it's physically there, it's not really that much possible to eradicate its existence physically, but through different manners you can really erase it from the urban scene.
Exactly, I understand. So there is a difference between just keeping it and then presenting or creating or highlighting it. Exactly. So there is that difference. They are not being demolished, but they are kind of downplayed.
Yes.
I'm saying, yeah, I understand that. Perhaps then another topic, the heritage making and inclusivity. Um, uh, uh, the book reads the transformation of the Sultanahmet district through the lens of regulations, states, officials, and institutions, bureaucratic correspondence, of both Ottoman and Turkish context. And implicitly, I think, I have two questions about this. The book implicitly proposes lived space as the antithesis of musealization, if I understand it correctly. So that brings to mind what kind of perhaps other lenses could have been used, complementary lenses to this institutional, policy-oriented, bureaucracy-oriented research. I mean, that is the one thing that, of course, comes to mind, that of the people. And you mentioned them, actually, the people who were kind of displaced at different periods in time in the Sultanahmet district. So I was thinking about the resistances. I mean, were there resistances to those, transformations, and how is it possible to, actually bring in the people, perhaps, to this story as well. I mean, but when I also think about resistance, I'm thinking about Ümit Fırat Açıkgöz's contentions about early Republican context. I mean, he is actually kind of highlighting a civil resistance through media, and he is saying that beyond the state, actually, there was a kind of civic understanding position. So what would you like to say about those?
Actually, that's like, if I criticize myself and my book, and I should probably, so
It is not my aim.
No, I know. I was also thinking that's a lot, and it's really like more or less it relies on the official archives, like official documents, more or less. I try to really put the motives on or mindsets of different actors, but they are all more or less state related. So initially, when I started actually my PhD, I was thinking to really put more the voices of people. So they become apparent in certain parts, a bit silent though, unless they are in the official documents. So more or less like what I trace during those resistance, those archival documents were like, there were some resistances, particularly for the displaced inhabitants, like there were petitions and that kind of resistances we can see, or from different associations related to history or cultural heritage. There were some resistances, for example, to Cemil Pasha's like attempt to demolish Hürrem Sultanbeyt, for example, but I more or less put them whenever they appear in the official archives, because like, okay, as I told you, like first I thought like I should really enter every archive. It started like that, and I should read every document and every published material. But in the end, like I limited myself to the official archives. Also, initially, I was thinking to make more like in-depth interviews with people already using the area or living more or less in the area, and how they see the transformation themselves. But I couldn't manage to do it due to the time limitation. I had to finalize my book and my PhD. Like with my book project also, I thought first I can add this dimension, but it was not possible maybe for another project. So I would like to really put the voices of people now, because the voices of documents is dominant over the voices of people.
Okay, well, we are looking forward to that. Well, I mean, my other question would be, I mean, this is a wonderful, story, but it is very much a local story, and I'm thinking about, and which might be as well, it is. I'm thinking about the recent, like, transnational, literature on these kinds of issues, like heritage making. I mean, I'm thinking about, for instance, Christina Luke's book, A Pearl in Imperial Heritage and Diplomacy in Turkey, or Lucientis Şenocak's book, Divided Spaces, Contested Past, the Heritage of the Gallipoli Peninsula. So there is, and also not only related to heritage, but in terms of what was going on in the Middle East, which is kind of, studied through the lens of more international, transnational currents. There is a, growing literature. I was, wondering about your case, if there are any transnational connections that you kind of came across.
Actually, one of the reasons why I picked Sultanahmet was still in the Turkish context. More or less, like, certain aspects of it can be considered as like transnational heritage, but if we like define transnational as like intercultural or shared heritage, more or less, like, that's also another discussion maybe. But when I like started also working on Sultanahmet, I realized that it's one of the most like, okay, I was telling it like as the public face, but not only domestic, but also internationally, it's the public face of Istanbul, what we might call. For example, the restoration of Ayasofya by Fossati brothers might be like an like international involvement, or more or less like the in the Ottoman period, the archaeological surveys and excavations on the Byzantine past of the neighborhood, and also Henry Prost's, of course, involvement in Istanbul's master plan, urban plan, and archaeological park project. And later, of course, Thomas Whittemore, Byzantine Institute of America, and later Dumbarton Oaks involvement, and later, of course, UNESCO's as another international actor involvement in the site. So you can see certain like transnational discussions, but still, like, when I check the history of heritage making, more or less, like, the Byzantine past is considered the transnational heritage of Sultanahmet, what we might call. But if we really define transnational as like shared heritage and intercultural, then for Turkish context, maybe it's not shared heritage now, or maybe not intercultural. So whether like Byzantine and Ottoman past can coexist together in Sultanahmet is another discussion. But more or less, the Byzantine layer is more like considered by many as more transnational heritage.
Well, perhaps this can take us to, like singular cases, and talking about Sultanahmet without really talking about, Hagia Sophia would be, perhaps unexpected. So unexpected. So would you like to say a couple of things about Hagia Sophia, both in terms of your research and also, perhaps the current situation as well?
Maybe like when I was doing PhD, I can say this, and I discussed with many, but the last layer I was talking about musealization, or the last phase was, of course, the current phase of Sultanahmet and its like interventions to the area, which was highlighting and still highlighting the Ottoman past of the neighborhood. Like what was happening from 2000s onwards, actually, with Ayasofya, I even wrote it like that at the time, but I wasn't expecting it. But in a way, it was more or less like a preparation of its conversion into a mosque, because like most of the Ottoman layers of the monument started to be highlighted in like late 2010s and 2012, 13 and 14. In a way, like that was like a preparation when I now think of it. So that was really like paving the way to its conversion. So when I think of at present Ayasofya's situation, so I still think that it kind of really teaches us a couple of things, or at least teaches me. One, heritage is really related to present day, and it's a present day ideological construct. So it's really offers a really unfortunate but good example of like how heritage is related to the present rather than the past. And still, like, it's one of the symbols, of course, of the competition of dominance of like early Republican ideology and neo-Ottomanist ideology, and still it's the what I call like ideological battleground. But like if we go back to transnational heritage, maybe I can say like if it's like a shared and more or less like intercultural heritage, which is according to me, of course, then like the rights or associations or demands of different communities related to Ayasofya should be heard. Like more or less like different people and different groups have different associations with the monuments itself. So we should really try to start from the lens of rights-based conservation approaches to the monument. Like I can talk a lot, but another thing I might say is like I haven't said it, but when we think of UNESCO also, still UNESCO values the nation state over transnational heritage in a way. So the viewpoint of nation state is still most heard even in like international conservation organizations. So we can discuss really a lot of issues, but in a way I always talk about this also. I think for my musealization process also, Ayasofya's transformation into a mosque more or less stopped the musealization of Sultanahmet. So it was like an ongoing and shared vision from the 19th century, maybe until recently 2020, but it really stopped the process, I think, and now there will be other dynamics, and maybe it's the time that we might call again Sultanahmet Square as a square, but not a touristic place. Maybe in 10 years, we will discuss these. So that's also like an important point for the process itself.
Exactly. And one of my questions would be whether there were any unexpected things in your research or during the whole process. And this conversion seems to be something like really out of the blue and unexpected for you, which kind of reverses the process that you talk about musealization. Exactly. We have good questions, very nice questions. I would like to read those, and we are waiting for other questions please do write your questions in the Q&A section. So the first question is from Eliza Galerdi, and I'm reading it. Hi, thank you very much for this interesting conversation. My question for Dr. Aykaç is, was there any place, city that you found useful to compare with your case study because of their similarities or differences?
That's really a good question. Thank you. So actually, I more or less try to compare different cities in the book based on different aspects of musealization. For example, for the early Republican attitude towards the Ottoman past, for example, Leningrad or St. Petersburg was a good, or like the way Russia, like Moscow also, but more like Leningrad was a good case, or how the archaeology of the city, like how, for example, Athens was in a way a good example. But I more use like Rome in more recent periods. And then after 1980s, like I discussed, like, for example, Barcelona, a bit, Bilbao, because like culture-led regeneration. And Skopje is like Balkan cities are really important when we discuss like the clash of like neo-Ottomanist ideologies over a multi-layered city. So actually, like there is not a one single case that I can compare, or I didn't want to do it in the book more or less, but for different discussions, I tried to put different aspects of different cities, more or less.
There is another, we have many questions. Please write your questions. We are waiting for them. And this one comes from Gökçenur Yazar. Considering the involuntary displacements, I want to hear the ideas of Pınar Hoca's on musealization and gentrification. And there's a smiling face there. Can musealization or misconducted musealization result in unintentional gentrification of the immediate surroundings? Is intentional gentrification a policy of politics? Can it be?
So that's also a very good question. So one of the surprises I had, I realized is related to actually like gentrification issues. So it really starts from the 19th period onwards in Sultanahmet. So there is this discussion of like there are street kids wandering around. This is one of the most important districts of Istanbul. So we have to collect those kids and send them to another neighborhood. So even there were like correspondences like that. So more or less, I think like starting with urban conservation, actually gentrification starts. Again, like I'm going back to our conceptualization of what is to be conserved. So at the time when urban conservation emerged, like that's how I evaluate it, more or less the physicality of the urban environment or historic cities were like considered valuable. So the social aspects were not really taken into consideration. So at the time, like the approach was really like more or less like expropriating all the important buildings there and forcing people to go somewhere else. But unlike urban regeneration, I think in musealization's case for Sultanahmet, there is not even gentrification because the area is so much musealized that new people are not coming to reside there. It's more like desertification we might call, or like empty, like this, like more or less it's deserted. I couldn't find the terminology, but we don't see even gentrification that much. Like new groups are like high income groups are not coming to this district because like of a lot of things, including like not enough infrastructure. But there, like when it comes to the like motive of state authorities, gentrification is one of the things, but can also be a side effect depending on the scale of the project. But more or less, it starts from the beginning as gentrification.
Thank you, Pınar. Another question by Barış Altan. Thanks a lot for the discussion. I have two questions. A couple of weeks ago, Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality announced its Sultanahmet project using a model. Could you have the chance to investigate this project? If so, how do you interpret it? Thanks. And the second question, should I read it now or would you like to go for the first one? Should I read both?
Maybe both. I can answer afterwards.
My perception of Sultanahmet Square is that it looks like an area where monuments from different periods are scattered around and lost their context. Because of this situation, a regular visitor may not easily understand the importance of this square, both in the Byzantine period and the Ottoman period. Do you think can any proposed project create a new context? Is it possible or necessary?
Thank you very much, Barış. Like, there are really good questions that I should also think a bit more. So I'm familiar with the project actually, and I saw the model also. So more or less the project tries to really highlight the multi-layered character of the area, which is a positive thing as far as I have investigated and taught now. But when it comes to whether a project can really solve a lot of problems or whether it's necessary is really like, you are right. Like, as conservation people, we don't just rely on one single project that will change everything about the area. First things first, there should be more like a holistic approach for the future of the entire like historic peninsula, and then within that for Sultanahmet district. But I think since Sultanahmet Square is more or less like it was one of the most like important public spaces of the Ottoman Empire and also the Byzantine period, I think its importance as a public space should still be there. So a project that will contribute to its kind of perception as a public space, I think, is important in a way, I might say.
Thank you. Now there is a question from Musealization Şen Ocak, who we just mentioned. Thank you for such an interesting discussion this evening. My question is about how musealization and tourism is defined and related in Sultanahmet, because it seems that you define tourism as largely external international tourism, but much of the tourism in the area has been local, especially in the last years of the pandemic, and it is generated from within the city itself, especially during times like Ramadan. How do you think this internal and locally generated tourism shapes the musealization process of the Sultanahmet area?
Actually, it's also a really important, nice question. I also thought about it a bit. I had to, during my PhD, to like as an observer. Of course, it wasn't like a very structured observation. But I tried to be there in Sultanahmet during Ramadan also a couple of times for different purposes, like for fasting, like opening the fasting, or there were some bazaars near the square or the demolished amphitheater. There were some like talks. So I tried to really go there, like if we can consider it as like domestic tourism. So how people engage with the site is very interesting. It's very, very different than international tourists. You are right, but in a way, certain aspects are similar. This time, like for the local tourists, what's highlighted is the Ottoman past of the area. So more or less, they are still contributing to the musealization of the area by highlighting the everyday life, this time of the Ottoman period of the district. So like before the recent periods, I didn't have that much data about the local tourists or international tourists. So I wish I had. I would have involved that also in the discussion, but for later periods, I still think they contribute to further musealization.
Thank you. There are three different questions by Burçin Altınsay. Perhaps for the first one, she says, what do you think of the latest demusealization of Ayasofya? Is it actually that? Already answered, maybe, she added. The second, let me read three or both,
Sure.
all of them, then perhaps you can choose which one you would like to go first. The musealization somehow saved the historic core of Istanbul. Do you picture how Sultanahmet would physically look like today if that was not the case? This is the second comment and question. And then there is this, do you think it was a misstep to connect cultural identity as an essential or base value of heritage making?
So they are really very good, but sometimes difficult, like questions, I might say. First thing, I really think that's the demusealization of Ayasofya. I really evaluated it like that. I think in the book also I wrote exactly demusealization because like a function really in like that's my own interpretation. But it doesn't only converse the function itself, but its meaning and also all the layers related to the monuments that I believe if it's not a museum that you can't really present the monument as like an multi-layered monument. So it's like demusealization. I think if I read the question correctly. The second one, yes, that's true. In a way, like musealization saved the historic like peninsula. But what I tried to showcase more or less, I can say is like as we discussed a bit with Belgin Hoca also, like we should really be critical to heritage making and heritage conservation. So more or less like any decision related to the peninsula is more or less a selection, and it might be political. That was my point of view. And my aim was really challenging this vision for like calling for alternative visions for not only to Sultanahmet, but since it's a global phenomenon to other parts of the like other parts of the world. But it's for sure it contributes to at least physical conservation of the historic peninsula. So do you think it was a misstep to connect as an essential or base of like also another thing like cultural identity and like heritage making? I think identity is one of the major aspects of a group that defines their own heritage. So heritage is really very much related to cultural identity, I might say, if I get the question right.
Okay, thank you, Pınar. Well, here there's a question. I don't know if you can answer that. You didn't. I don't think that you worked in the archives in Germany, but but I can just ask. İnşirah Betül Bilici writes. Firstly, thank you for your speech. I found it very inspirational. And my question is, why getting into archives is not reachable in Turkey, even if for a PhD student? Is it same in Germany or other countries?
So I'm not familiar with Germany, but I'm a bit familiar with the UK. So it's a different story, really, like when you compare the archives in the UK versus in Turkey. But I think why it's difficult is more or less we actually have a regulation about like archives, what is called archival material and what's not. So for heritage studies, I think the thing is we deal with more like not archival material, but more or less material of a recent past. And it's always for example, I have a lot of documents I collected during my PhD. And if I want to open a lawsuit about certain aspects, I can. So that's, I think, the biggest fear, I think, of state authorities for not letting researchers enter archives. That's my, of course, interpretation. But in a way, like once you convince them about like the scope of your project or like how you will use that project, you have to be insisting a lot. It took me, as I said, like for more than a month. But in a way, when they realize that you really need that document for research, then sometimes the attitudes change. I don't know whether it's the case, and also it depends sometimes with one particular person or personality. That's also interesting, but I don't know. That's the reason why I think archival research, for at least the recent past, is difficult in Turkey.
Perhaps I think we don't have any other questions. If you have questions, please write now. Elisa Galardi is thanking, and I will read that. Thank you very much. I look forward to reading your book. This is from Elisa Galardi, who asked the first question, I think. I don't think that we have much time left, but perhaps one or two questions I can add. I think we have around 10 minutes. One of them is, as we have discussed this, Gizem has, he's thanking. Gizem Tongo is thanking you. Thanks a lot for this great conversation. Looking forward to your book, Pınar. On that note, perhaps we can talk a little bit about the future of conservation of cultural heritage. Seems that there are so much new approaches and criticism. It's a very lively, vibrant field, apparently. So how do you see that?
Actually, it's really a very good question also. So how I see that is, now I think, I don't know whether I am the person to really discuss a lot about the future of heritage studies as a field. But what I see is really now the heritage studies is informed by and is informing many disciplines. So in a way, as you also said, Belgin Hocam, so we are borrowing different methodologies from different disciplines. And also, of course, certain disciplines are borrowing certain aspects. But how I see the future is I always think that we are evolving to that, like people-centered approach is what we might call, but people here are not only the people, but things like maybe in architectural history, more or less we are moving away from people-centered approaches in a way. But in heritage studies, what I mean is not only the society, tangible, intangible aspects, human, non-human agents. So more or less like moving out of the heritage specialists, but more or less like communities, society, and different agents, more or less, like other disciplines.
Thank you. There are more questions. Okay. From Elif Nur İpek, thank you for these good discussions, Pınar Hocam. My question is, what was the biggest challenge you faced while working on this layered historical peninsula that is home to many civilizations? One of the challenges, perhaps, you talked about several challenges.
Elif, really, thank you. I told in the beginning a bit like I have many regrets, but in a way, I think the most challenging thing is, of course, like there was excessive amount of data. So how to process it, how to systematize it, and how to use it to achieve or like to have a coherent narrative out of it. So I really use, like, for example, geographic information system. Otherwise, I wouldn't have really compiled data, because I have data about every single monument or open space in Sultanahmet from the archives, like their decisions or projects or applications. So I tried to really process that huge amount of data. We can't call it maybe big data, but for me, for an individual, it was a big data. So that was the biggest challenge.
Well, the next question comes from Gizem Tongo, which was also my last question. So we are asking together with Gizem, what is next? What is your next project?
Oh, that's really a very good question also. So I have a couple of things in my mind. First, of course, like related with Sultanahmet, how the area is perceived today by the inhabitants and tourists. I really want to work on that. The other thing is now I'm a bit more interested in, TICA involvement in other in the former territories of the Ottoman Empire. So the current policy of the Turkish government in the Balkans, Africa, and the Middle East. So I'm like, if I have grants, of course, it's not easy to work on those issues. And also I was thinking, again, if I have grants, like how Hagia Sophia's conversion into a mosque is received by different diaspora communities is another thing. If I have grants, I'd like to do. So again, more or less on like neo-Ottomanist heritage policies in different parts of the world, I think.
Important projects, certainly. We are looking forward to those.
I hope I can get grants. We'll see.
I think we don't have any other question, and we don't probably have much time left. So I'm looking to Yağmur. Thank you, Yağmur.
Thank you so much. It was really impressive. Thank you so much for this really impressive and critical talk, Professor Özkaya and Professor Aykaç. And also, I would like to thank you, our attendees too, for joining us today. Have a nice evening. İyi akşamlar.
İyi akşamlar.
İyi akşamlar.
Thank you very much.